Hi, I'm Liz Pellett. Very nice to meet you. Glad that you could join us today on this recorded webinar. We are going to be talking about organizational culture and the cultural revolution. And I believe that today we are experiencing that more and more. I always am quoted to say that cultural change is an evolution and not a revolution. But until this pandemic, I would have never expected that organizations would have to shift and pivot and stop doing some of the things that they had done every day, all day. And that really has evolved, if you will, into a cultural revolution. Let's go ahead and get started, and I'll take you on a little journey. You know, culture can be created consciously or by default. And if we take a look at how culture is created, and we're going to look at that, we can absolutely see that there is a way that we can create this culture in a way that we can evolve a culture. But it takes an awful lot of people, you know, we're going to get to the point where it's not just leaders, but let's take a look. So how is culture created, right? Simple 4-box model, you think about it, it's the actions and the behaviors of the leaders. It's what leaders are paying attention to, what gets rewarded, and yes, what gets punished, as well as the allocation of resources. And that really is how culture is created. But here's an interesting note. If you look at the box on the left-hand side where it says leaders, this doesn't have to be the C-suite. A leader can be anyone who supervises or manages people. This could be third shift supervisor at a hospital who supervises housekeeping staff or food service staff. And it really is the action and the behavior that people are going to follow, what leaders are paying attention to, what gets rewarded and what gets punished, as well as the allocation of resources. So let's keep this in mind as we run through the whole idea of a cultural revolution. There's a company called Zappos, and Tony Hsieh is the CEO of Zappos, and there's a really interesting story about him. He actually sold his first company to Microsoft for about 120 million USD. And when he was asked, why did you sell the company? He said, it was interesting because they weren't intentional about how they built their culture. He said, so it was a great company, we had great product, but unfortunately, we had a really bad culture. So we decided to sell it and then start Zappos, but really with keeping in mind the culture and how to build it. So you have a CEO, and it's a US example all the time of how to build culture and how to keep it real. But you know, it's not always about, right? It's not always about leadership. There's so many other things that go into your organizational culture. But if you go back and think about that 4-box model, a lot of this still really makes sense, right? So there's many things that go into what's your culture. And even if you look at this particular model, a lot of times when we do a cultural assessment, we find that this is really important across the board. You know, I started measuring culture 20 years ago. Whoa, I know it's a long time. And people would actually ask me, hey, why do people hire you? I mean, culture's not a thing. And I would say there's 3 times that you need to really look at your culture. There's 3 different things. One is an organization that's really evolved, maybe like Zappos, and they want to understand what and assess what their culture is, so they actually work on it. And then the other is an acquisition, right? Not a merger, because there is no M in M&A, but in an acquisition, we find that organizations want to really understand what the 2 cultures are. Or the third thing was always a company has tried to fix everything and anything and gone to big consulting houses or small consulting houses, tried to change, and they just haven't figured it out. So they get to a point where it's like, maybe we would actually need to do some kind of assessment. So that's kind of what cultural assessments are all about. So in today's environment, what we're seeing is cultures are shifting. right in front of you, but you virtually can't see it. And I love that line because so many of us went virtual immediately, and your organization is not in brick and mortar. They are remote, they are virtual. So the the bottom line of not even being able to be together and to interact in that way is a cultural shift. And if you want to know what I mean by you can't see it, or maybe you don't see it, some of you may see a cat with a rat in its mouth, and some of you might see a face between the cat and the rat with red lips and a gold earring. You see, we see things very differently. In multicultural and global organizations, it's even more important because we hear and see information differently. You know, it is the iceberg. It's true. Culture is what you see on the top, but the real truth is what it is underneath. And interesting, when we do some cultural assessments, some of the feedback we get, and this might sound silly, but is even about, you know, the chairs in the break room are broken. That sends a message to the employees about, do you care or do you don't care? And whether it's we're looking at what's happening today or what was happening 6 months ago, these are still foundational culture indicators that's really important to look at. So when we talk about metrics and measurement, I am kind of a weird HR person, so I'm in human resources, but I'm absolutely a data geek, and that's why I love to do these assessments. And here are just some of the dimensions, cultural dimensions that we like to measure when we get there. Okay, so we're going to measure it, and we're going to understand current state, and then we're going to decide and build desired state or future state together. And somewhere in the middle, there's this gap, right? Now, it could be a small gap, but it could also be a big gap. And I think that's what a lot of organizations are going through right now is, hey, we were super remote before. I've got clients that were virtual all along. And then I've got clients that have said, universities are a great example. This is freaking us out. I mean, we can't have any sports. We can't have people on campus. It's a ghost town. So, you know, you have these chasms. And what we find with these gaps is it's really important to understand the change and change management that's going to take place. Physically, we understand that if organizations have moved out of brick and mortar, and some of them aren't even back yet, is that going to change the composite of the organization? And financially, what is that going to look like? How are we going to adjust systems? You know, in the first 3 weeks of this, it was, how do I get on the VPN? How do I get on the share, right? But once we got that straightened out, then it became a lot of human elements, which I think is really important in the cultural shift, because that's the behavioral piece that is the most important. And if you look at the bottom of this, you'll see our beliefs, our norms, our artifacts, how we have behaved, leadership behavior. And that's the bottom, that's a foundation that we really should be looking at. Okay, evolution versus a revolution. Here you go. Cultural evolution, in my opinion, used to be years. And it all depended on the organization on how long it would take. But now we are moving at the speed of light. And we can see the physical change, not even in 2 months, the physical change in 2 days. There was a shift. Let's go. We need to go. We need to work remote. And that's how things went. But we slowly see, you know, it's interesting. I'm going to look at this model myself for a minute. It's like if that was 2 days, then systems was 1 month and behaviors was 3 to 4 months, and purposeful culture, we're at the 6-month mark. And this is where we need to look. I want to talk a little bit about cultural evolution, revolution, but how values drive culture. And values are the cornerstone and the foundation of any organization. So it's really important to understand how values alignment is actually shifting some of this cultural revolution. But for organizations that have built a foundation on their values, they are more shored up. They can build better because their foundation is so solid. And I'm going to give a couple examples of some of the companies who've demonstrated that greatly. But keep in mind, values really do drive culture. And if you have significant values that are your foundation, right, then there's an interesting idea around aligning personal values with company values. And what we find is if companies are actually hiring for cultural fit, interviewing in a value-based environment and competency-based environment, those employees have a higher retention rate. And that equates to profitability. That equates to bottom line and money. I think there's a challenge, if you will. There's a significant challenge with this shift that we're seeing and the evolution, that if the foundational values are not in place, then the personal alignment might not be there. So I just stated, right? If you got personal alignment, you're going to have a higher level of retention. You're going to have a higher rate of tenure, which definitely equates to the bottom line and profitability. Why? Because high turnover costs organizations money, but it also speaks to the level of employee engagement. Well, if we don't have employees who are engaged, and we don't have employees that are highly productive. So if you're not engaged, you're like, whatever. That's a low level of productivity, which directly translates into profitability. So we've got to start understanding when we talk about our organizational culture that we're really looking at the foundation of our organization and how we can support that to be profitable and to ensure that our employees are engaged. Because, man, culture matters. It just does. We did a study of over 5,000 individuals, and what we found was 98% of those individuals, and I know that's a small study, it's not a global study, it's not a massive study, but just looking around, 98% believe that culture is just as, if not more important than compensation, which leaves about 2% who are working for the money. Now, we know there are jobs and there are companies that people have to work for the money, and it's all about the paycheck. But if we also understand that culture really matters of how we treat people and how we engage people, we might be able to achieve that profitability, because we know that companies that have values and cultural alignment, they have higher revenue growth. Employees stay longer, which means they're going to grow their employee population. If you're on the stock market and you're a public company, it usually equates into stock, and that equates into net personal wealth income. And your culture is your brand. What people are saying about you. If you've never heard about Glassdoor, take a look, glassdoor.com. Most US companies are on it, and employees have a lot to say about it. Now, 5 years ago, I would have told you that it was a place where people just went to complain about their organization. But they've really turned it around, and it's an opportunity, especially for human resources, to reply and talk to their employees who might not have been satisfied with their engagement. And a lot of the comments really have to do with culture. The bottom line is that companies that really live their values are a better place to work, because your values are your foundation of your culture. So let's go to COVID. Let's talk about right now what's happening and some of the companies that are true to their culture. I can't speak outside of the United States because I don't live there and I don't interact with those companies. So let me keep it to the US. Um, these are 4 companies. Well, actually, IKEA is not a US company. But these are 4 companies that really stayed true to their culture. Zappos is an example, immediately went working from home, but did some really cool things like set up YouTube channels and these interactive communications where employees can share their stories like, oh my gosh, I'm staying home, I got to walk my dog 7 times. And other side of that where, you know, people have children and they have to, and there's no school. And so that was really human approach that Zappos took, which I liked very much. There's an airline, Southwest Airline. They've always said they have a big heart, and they were one of the first airlines here to come out and say, the biggest concern we have is for our employees and our customers. So that was really important. And I got as a frequent flyer, direct email from the CEO. IKEA was very quick to say, you have to go home, but we're going to pay you. And they paid through a 45-day window, but then they also agreed that they were going to continue your benefits. So while you might not have your full paycheck and after this time frame stop, you at least will have your health benefits. Netflix is an interesting company, and they absolutely rely on the creativity and production crews that shoot these shows, that video these shows for public viewing. And it was super interesting to see that they donated over $100,000 to the crews and the folks who who video these programs for them. So it's a really cool thing that Netflix did, but it stays true, right? It stays true to their foundational values. In the first 15 days after the pandemic hit, I read a lot of articles, and it was super interesting to me to look at global standardization and who was doing it and who was not. So I just want to give a shout out to Starbucks, because I believe, number one, in an article that I read, it really from the CEO talked about how important it was. Their number one focus was on customers and crew, right? Didn't talk about, I might not have a sustainable product, or we might be out of materials. It wasn't in their purview. Their purview was stick to your values and stay to your foundation. And they did a great job. So good job, Starbucks, global standardization. Well, what can go wrong if you're not living those values and your company culture is like kind of shifting in this way and that way? And, you know, Amazon made some major mistakes about social distancing and about protests and about violence and about walkouts. And they really reacted in a negative way. Now, Amazon, you know, is where a lot of people get things. But if your leadership is really not paying attention, hear no, see no, speak no, you're going to lose some money. I know myself, kind of backed off a little bit about my Amazon and started going direct to the distributor and buying from them. Yeah, sure, I might have had to pay a couple bucks in shipping, but it was more important to me to do that as a consumer. So if that's me as a consumer, I'm sure there's many others out there. So not living your values can be a really big thing. You know, it's funny, when I did strategic planning for a long time with boards, and about 5 years ago, everyone wanted a strategic plan that was 2020 vision, right? Because if you have 2020 vision, you're perfect. And here we are in 2020, right? And nothing should go back to normal. If we go back to the way things were, we'll have lost the lesson. And we have some serious cultural lessons to learn here about how things have shifted and where they've shifted to. So let's talk about strategy for just a minute, because your organizational culture is kind of built on that strategy. You have strategic goals, where you're going. You have a purposeful culture, how you're going to get there, and then you have enablers. And what we're seeing right now are there significant enablers to how we're going to get there. And as we reboot and come back, whether it's to the brick and mortar building or not, we need to really understand how we are looking at going forward, how we are looking at mobilization and shifting and pivoting and being as positive but flexible as we can. And look up in the left-hand side and the strategic goals. Have those changed? They might have. You know, we have many businesses that are shifting from the product that they made to the product they're making now. And I have one example because it's like, we want to talk about a pendulum swing. Whoa. There's a liquor producer named Bacardi Rum, very famous, big seller, at least back in the day. And Bacardi actually changed their manufacturing plant to start making plastic masks and shields, and that was a big shift for them. Are they going to continue? I don't know. Maybe they split the plant in half. I don't know. But I just know that their strategy, right? Their strategy had to change. You go this way counterclockwise and you go that way. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. I talked a little bit about, change and how this is going. And I really just wanted to use this particular model. And I know hopefully you get the recording or you see these slides, because this is truth. Whether it's a acquisition or no more brick and mortar or a new way of seeing things, you can even reflect on your own situation, right? When we had to leave our buildings or things changed, there's fear. Some people felt paralyzed, skeptical, confused with the discomfort of the change. I find it today when I still go out to stores and people aren't wearing masks, even though here I am in the state of California and they're mandated. So there is this discomfort. But from a cultural perspective, once you get out of that danger zone, we can really start the discovery and the anticipation and trying to get people energized again. But it has to be through really great communication to create that understanding of where we're going. I don't know how fast we're going to get out of stage 4 myself. I sure hope we do. But I can actually say I've been through stage 1, 2, and 3 in the last 3 months, and I'm moving into a different direction. And I know many organizations are moving. That's the whole idea around reboot. So think about that and this model as we start our change efforts. It's pretty interesting to think about how we have evolved, right? Is there a new normal? People ask me that all the time. What is the new normal? How can there be a new normal? I don't think there is. I believe that we don't know culturally what's going to happen to many organizations. We believe that you can come back and will come back stronger. But the way to do that is really based on these cultural understandings, organizational values, and quite frankly, employee engagement. And if we're not concerned about that, then we're not really looking at the full picture of how we are going to move through this. Again, we wonder, can you really evaluate your organizational culture? Can you assess it? And the answer is yes. There's a scientific and data-driven way that we measure organizational culture to look at health and unhealth. Do you have a healthy culture? Do you have an unhealthy culture? And if you have one or the other, what does that actually translate into? Does that mean you're more profitable? Does that mean you're less profitable? And when we assess these cultures, we find these gap analysis. And now is the time to do this, to look at the current state of your organization and your desired state or your future state, where you're going to be. You might not ever go back to brick and mortar. So in there, there's this gap analysis that needs to be looked at and identified as to how are you going to close this gap. The gap would be like this, the gap would be like that. But understanding and having data about your current state, snapshot in time. Actually, I'll tell you a funny story. It was February, February 2020. We did a cultural assessment for an electrical co-op here in the States. And we've been doing their cultural assessments every 2 years for 4 cycles. So we've been together a while. We went ahead and conducted the cultural assessment, and they're one of the healthiest companies I've ever assessed. Their response rate is for 350 employees is like 98%. So they've got some good things going on. And once we presented the results in February, by the time action planning came around, meaning we work on action plans that go and work through the gaps that we might have found or anything that wasn't healthy or anything that was unhealthy, it was the end of March. Well, the end of March, early April was not February. So we had to take a couple steps back and say, do we have the right data? Are we actually going to build action plans on February data when it's the end of March? And what we decided to do was resurvey, but not the whole survey. Actually take the survey that we found the least healthy areas and ask those maybe 12 questions, but then ask some real questions about how did the organization respond to this pandemic? And that was very important for them because in the last few survey cycles, we hadn't done much for change management. So that was really interesting. I'm going to leave you with this thought. Provide the feedback, define the values, hold people accountable, and consequences. You know, the most dangerous phrase in any language is we've always done it this way. And that's not the way we can do it any longer. We're at a point in our history and our global environment where the way we've done things just isn't going to work, especially when you're looking at organizational culture. How are leaders going to drive this? Remember that 4-box model? Allocation of resources, what gets rewarded and what gets punished, behaviors of the leaders, what we're paying attention to. And I know right now is a very difficult time for a lot of leaders, you know, looking at profitability, looking at keeping their companies alive, small business owners, big business owners, and people, the people who drive and support our organizations. These are the folks that need to be asked. This is the time for cultural assessment. Please feel free to go to my website, www.globalcultureguru.com, or just shoot me a note, lizpellet@gmail.com. 2 Z's, LIZZ, Quick shout out to this organization, not only the Global Gurus, but the folks who put this together, Lily, Arthur. Fantastic job, tireless motivation and coordination. Apologize that I couldn't do this live. Schedules conflict, but I hope this recorded video will serve as a real look into what's happening today in the cultural evolution, because it's not. It has turned into the cultural revolution. Thanks very much for spending time with me. I really appreciate the Global Guru organization. I've been on the list for the last 4 years and appreciate every year that I am nominated to the slate. I'm going to stop my share, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Have a great night or day.